Within the extensive history of League of Legends, there are champions that used to be extremely, and I have to emphasize extremely prevalent back in the day that rarely if ever see consistent usage now, which I find to be pretty interesting. It's not often you come across a champion who routinely carried a play rate north of 20% for multiple stretches of time throughout the year, and then regressed into near complete obscurity, whether because of the champion itself being changed or the game's climate, in which case it may have been both. Maokai used to be one of the most notorious tanks in League for the sheer breadth of utility and consistency he offered in battle, even going so far as to be one of the few tanks in the early days to be genuinely capable of carrying games. At the height of his career, his dominance could not be overstated, being a frequent sight in Diamond Plus, but outside of a stretch of time around 2023 when Riot tried to push him into jungle and support, he's practically become a shell of his former self. What exactly happened to him that made him go from an everyday pick to one of the least popular champions in the game? We'll be finding out in today's Why No One Plays episode, featuring the Twisted Treant. To better understand why he's unpopular now, we should first take a look at why he was popular before. I mentioned earlier that Maokai was one of the few tanks in League who actually possessed a modicum of carry potential, unusual for a member of his class. That's because he was one of the few quote-unquote battle tanks in League, champions with all the characteristics of a tank but who were geared more towards combat than utility. Looking at his past iteration, Maokai seems to have a most excellent arsenal of abilities. Sap Magic allows him to restore a chunk of health based on the amount of skills that get used around him, with the idea that if he's in the middle of a giant teamfight, he'd be able to heal non-stop with the sheer volume of skills being casted around him. His Q was the same back then as it is now, an AoE blast that knocks enemies back and sends a pulse forward to slow enemies. Low cooldown, low mana cost, serviceable damage and range. Not a bad DPS tool in a tank by any means, least of all one that's a disruption tool in and of itself. Twisted Advance was also one of the best crowd control tools a tank or frankly any champion could ask for. It still is. A point and click dash to a champion that roots them in place on arrival, and it even makes Maokai untargetable, making it one of the few dash abilities in the game to completely bypass anti-dash measures like Poppy W, Veigar Cage, or any kind of disruption like Body Slam or Vault Breaker. Back then it used to do max health damage too. Then we have Sapling Toss, one of the best macro tools in the game, and basically gave Maokai an infinite supply of wards that he could throw from a far distance to scout out enemies, and as well, the saplings were zoning tools. In most cases, the damage they did was by no means a point of concern, but it's sort of the mental thing where even though you can face tank a sapling and not really care, that doesn't mean you were excited about it, so people would just run away from them. Each of Maokai's abilities had great utility in addition to offensive pressure, lending themselves to his early popularity, and when combining all of that with his iconic Vengeful Maelstrom, it was easy to understand why people enjoyed playing him so much. Not only was he easy to play, but he was effective at covering a wide range of scenarios. Good lane sustain and wave clear with his Q and passive, good point and click engage and lockdown on W. It was basically impossible to beat Maokai in vision control since he could throw wards anywhere he wanted, and when a teamfight actually did break out, that was when he was at his best. Vengeful Maelstrom gave Maokai the ability to mitigate all non-turret damage dealt to himself and his team, effectively inflicting exhaust on the entire enemy team, and then at the end of his ultimate he could blow up the entire ring around him for damage based on how much he mitigated. It was hard to quantify just how much gold value Maokai's ultimate gave his team. Reducing all damage taken from enemy champions by 20% can be game altering. And it was. Maokai was one of the hardest tanks to shut down mid to late game because of how much he could heal, the constant disruption and hard CC, and how he made his team practically invincible all while doing respectable damage of his own. They had to nerf this guy so many times between season 4 and 7 before he eventually got his new ultimate. Sen rework is actually reason number 1 behind people no longer enjoying Maokai that much. I would argue the central factor for why he was so good was one word: consistency. Longtime viewers of this series know that consistency, or lack thereof, can drastically affect a player's willingness to stick with a champion long term. Due to him being so straightforward yet effective to play, Riot's goal was to, at least in theory, make him more rewarding to play in the right circumstances under the condition that he had to play in those circumstances. In other words, Maokai went from a generalist tank to a rather niche one. When he got changed in 2017, they basically rearranged all the good parts of his kit to make them harder to access in exchange for presumably giving you more payoff if you did that, but that ended up being the reason people stopped including him in their champion pools. Here are some examples. Sap Magic was adjusted to heal for a considerably larger amount per proc, and even made it based on cooldown, not spell charges. The caveat was that said cooldown would only decrease if Maokai himself was struck by enemy spells. Prior, it used to be if any spell was cast around him period, not just his own, similar to Kassadin's 4 spells. So while it may look really good in theory, Maokai actually healed for a lot less with his new passive than his old one. Another example would be the max health damage that used to be on Twisted Advance. Maokai's W was not only an untargetable gap closer and not only a point-and-click 2-second route, but it was also a big chunk of damage to go along with it. Given he used to build Rod of Ages, Maokai's W late game could potentially do 17% max health damage or more per cast. Following the mid-scope, however, that easy-to-access damage was shuttled to his Sapling Toss, which once again, in theory, was a buff since he could now do % health damage from a far distance and AoE damage at that. Not to mention the whole brush thing doubling the potential damage to make it even stronger. But Sapling Toss isn't an easy ability to land in the actual heat of battle, of which on the other hand Twisted Advance was. Again, we had the possibility of greater max health damage, somewhat cancelled out by it being significantly harder to land and therefore more inconsistent. Even in the scope of his new ultimate Nature's Grasp, a completely new purpose and function compared to Vengeful Maelstrom, in spite of it being apples to oranges in the sense of what they're supposed to accomplish, the same notion applies here. Nature's Grasp is one of the scariest ultimates in the game. It covers a massive area both in width and especially length, and each bramble can root for potentially up to 2¼ seconds if it hits a target. You might be able to ignore a 1-second root or even 1.5, but 2 seconds or longer usually means you're gonna die if you get caught by it. A massive area covering crowd control with the potential to root the entire enemy team for an eternity if you land all 5 thorns on each enemy champion. At a surface glance, it appears to be a far bigger deal than damage mitigation, absurd as that sounds. At the same time, when looking at these two ultimates side by side, which one's maximum value is more achievable? Obviously the former, right? Nature's Grasp has a higher payout, yes, but on average, Vengeful Maelstrom produced more consistent value. That's something Maokai's lost across effectively his entire kit. He is much less consistent. How this negatively affected his popularity was because Maokai may have been the most consistent general tank of them all. He wasn't the most durable, nor did he have the highest crowd control output either. He also wasn't the highest damaging tank, nor did he have any party buffing utility outside of his saplings giving extra vision. All the same, he made up for it by being consistently reliable. Every other tank in the game has a major blind spot or weak point in their kit. Malphite can be near indestructible when taking on physical damage and auto attacks, but he melts to pieces against magic damage. Nautilus has more crowd control than you know what to deal with, but his damage output is among the lowest in the game, even though all 4 of his abilities do damage due to lacking any semblance of % health or tank scaling within them. Sion has quite possibly the highest overall pressure ceiling of any tank in the game when you consider the full force of his Q and ultimate. But how often do you encounter a situation where he can land a full power ultimate and a full power Q on the enemy team? No, boss doesn't count. We're talking about the average Hearthstone Emerald 2000 games player, not a challenger player. I think you get the point. Other tanks that are beefier, had more crowd control, more engage, more whatever than Maokai. What Maokai had that they didn't was that never was there a situation where he was a bad idea. He was just that stable. Now though, you'd be hard pressed to argue he excels at anything. Damn near every part of his gameplay was made replicable by other means or outright eclipsed altogether. In regards to healing faculty, Zac, Mundo, or frankly any tank that builds unending despair can heal just as much as Maokai can, and with the game being more bursty and tank shreddy than ever, pure bulk matters a lot more than sustain, meaning it's better for a tank to have 5000 HP than to have 2500 HP and heal 2500 HP over the course of a fight. One is upfront, therefore being guaranteed every single time. The other might not come into play. Crowd control wise though, he did get a massive teamfight route in the form of his ultimate. Around the same time, a new tank was released that could also turbo CC the enemy team in mass quantity, Ornn. If anything, Call of the Forge God brings to focus the same idea that Maokai previously used to be known for, consistency. Ornn's ultimate may not have the same crowd control duration or even effect radius as Maokai's, but it's sure as hell easier to land. For that matter, we just have a lot more ways to AoE crowd control now. Down in support you have Rel, in the jungle you have Nunu post CGU with this giant snowball W and AoE root on his Z, two things that old Nunu never had. The competition is just stiffer now, and ironically, by trying to make Maokai less general and more unique, they ended up making him less unique because the actual unique thing about him was his amazing pressure floor, not ceiling. Further worsening his popularity was the decision to make Maokai a flex pick. Flex picks had to skirt a razor-thin line between overpowered and useless by way of their susceptibility to overrunning the meta if they're made even the slightest bit strong. When taking a look at his popularity history, you'll notice major spikes throughout late 2022 to early 2024. Around this time is when Riot gave him an opening to play into jungle and support. 12.17 oversaw a huge bust given to him for those purposes. Sap Magic was made to work more effectively in the jungle, as well as Bramble Smash doing bonus damage to monsters and % health damage, enabling jungle Maokai to clear camps more quickly and support Maokai to stay competitive in damage, at least in relation to other tank supports like Nautilus and Leona. Additionally, Sapling Toss no longer does max health damage, instead just scaling by its bonus health and a lot of AP, making AP Bruiser support or jungle Maokai a substantial threat, especially with the scaling slow intensity added to it. They also just made his ultimate a bit faster in advancing. The upside to making him a flex pick in 3 roles is that on paper it gives people more opportunity to play him and therefore make him a bit more popular, which is true. The downside is that you run into what Smolder and Zeri ran into, where being flexed into so many roles puts an even bigger target on you, since now you have multiple roles potentially complaining about you as opposed to only being annoying to top laners like Maokai used to be. It is a double-edged sword, and in the case of Maokai, I would say it hurts him more than it helps. Tanks as a class are more likely to be impacted by numbers changes. They have less skill expression after all. You can't get much out of them, especially not Maokai. For a multi-dimensional, multifaceted champ like Aphelios, something like nerfing the Q damage on one of his weapons by 20 per level isn't gonna matter that much. For Maokai on the other hand, flipping his Q damage up or down by that amount can matter a lot more. And now Riot has to manage his performance in jungle and support alongside top. They had to make sure his solo laning isn't too overbearing in top lane, they had to make sure his clear speed, clear sustain, and gank pressure isn't too strong in mid lane, and they had to ensure his damage output and durability are not too oppressive to make him do more damage than his ADC down in support. They have to keep an eye on so many things now that it makes it close to unfeasible to give Maokai more than what he currently has, even though what he currently has isn't enough to make people want to play him over most other tanks in the game. Speaking of which, final reason why people stopped playing Maokai is because demographically speaking, top laners were the ones most likely to play Maokai consistently. After all, he used to only be a top laner, and ostensibly he's a very comfy tank to play in top by virtue of what I said earlier about being an all-purpose battle tank. At least the past iteration. Replacing Vengeful Maelstrom severely nerfed his top lane presence given the inherently less dueling-oriented purpose of his current ultimate. Where that alone he may have been able to survive, but then you also have the sheer number of new tank busters that were added to top lane over the years following his heyday. Camille, Ornn funnily enough, Sett, Yone, Gwen's a huge one, Cassante, Ambessa, Zahen, most of these guys can break through a tank no problem, and that's just in top lane, imagine all the other roles included. The best tanks in the game right now are those that can also deal tons of damage. Maokai used to do good damage, but then they took away his damage-oriented ultimate for a crowd control one, so now he actually does comparatively little damage. Factor them together and there are very few matchups in top lane that Maokai convincingly wins. Consequently, he's been extradited from top lane and forced into jungle and support, 2 roles he can only perform well in if he's overtuned because of the sheer competition in both. Transparently, this might just be nostalgia for the old version, but I think the worst thing to happen to Maokai was Nature's Grasp. It's a good ultimate objectively speaking, but Maokai was empirically more practical back when he had Vengeful Maelstrom. There is nary a circumstance where his specific toolset performs consistently well even without overtuned numbers. Tanks need to stand out in a specific niche in order to be successful in the modern day to offset not having much mechanical expression to them. Malphite stands out as an armor beater with a big dumb ultimate. Ornn stands out as a tank that can out-damage even fighters and upgrade your team's items. Sion's a big fat HP brute who can do tons of damage and be a big wall. Shen has his iconic ultimate. Maokai doesn't really have anything like that anymore. It used to be his ultimate being a teamfight buff. I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm being serious, more people would play Maokai if he went back to his old ultimate. It's like the Zac thing, if you guys remember Zac's other ultimate. Sure, in the right conditions it could be a really busted teamfight ultimate basically turning into a group insect, but realistically his original ultimate is just a lot more consistent. People want consistency in their champions. More consistency means more agency. More agency equals less frustration. And if you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I say this all the time. Frustration is the single most common reason why people quit playing a game, or in this case quit playing a champion. They want agency over their champion to feel in control. Maokai just doesn't really feel in control of a lot of things the way he used to be. Anyway, that about sums up my thoughts on why Maokai doesn't get played as often anymore. He might have an occasional blip in popularity here and there, but those are all circumstantial. At his core, he's a far less impactful tank now. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with my points, or do you think it's something else? Let me know in the comments down below. That'll be all for today, so if you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.